Over 300 people lost their lives in airplane accidents in 2024, making it the deadliest year for aviation since 2018. The final week of the year was especially tragic, with 2 of the 3 deadliest crashes occurring just days apart. This sharp rise in fatalities stands in stark contrast to 2023, which was hailed as the safest year in aviation history with no major passenger aircraft accidents. Some disasters were unavoidable tragedies, while others should never have happened. From a missile strike to a runway collision, these were the deadliest aviation disasters of 2024. The year had just begun when the first serious accident occurred. Japan Airlines Flight 516 collided with a Coast Guard aircraft upon landing at Haneda Airport, igniting a massive fire and resulting in multiple fatalities. On January 2, 2024, a Japan Airlines Airbus A350 was on final approach to Haneda Airport in Tokyo. The flight had been smooth, and the aircraft was cleared to land on runway 34 right. Meanwhile, a Japan Coast Guard Dash 8 was taxiing toward the same runway, preparing for departure on a mission to deliver earthquake relief supplies following the Noto earthquake. The aircraft had already been delayed by 40 minutes, and the crew felt pressure to make up for lost time. As the Dash 8 moved along the taxiway, air traffic control instructed it to taxi to holding point C5 as number 1. C5 is a designated holding point at Haneda Airport, where aircraft wait for clearance before entering an active runway. The instruction was intended to direct the Dash 8 to hold short at this location and wait for further clearance. The phrase "number 1" indicated that the aircraft was first in line for takeoff, but it did not explicitly grant clearance to enter the runway. The Dash 8 crew misunderstood the instruction. Instead of stopping at C5, the aircraft continued moving forward, crossed the holding point, and entered runway 34 right. The same runway where Flight 516 was just moments away from landing. At that moment, no one in the control tower or aboard the A350 realized the danger. The controllers, focused on managing multiple aircraft, did not notice that the Dash 8 had passed the holding point and entered the active runway. Inside the cockpit, the pilots followed their normal landing procedures. The Dash 8 was in a blind spot, invisible until the final moments of the approach. A runway conflict alert appeared on the controllers' screens, a warning that an aircraft was occupying an active runway. However, the system was known to trigger false alerts, often flagging potential conflicts even when aircraft were still at a safe distance. Over time, controllers had learned to ignore these warnings, and this time was no different. Unaware of the Dash 8's presence, the pilots continued their approach. Seconds passed as the aircraft descended, fully committed to landing. Only in the final moments did the Dash 8 become visible in the A350's landing lights. By then, it was far too late. The aircraft was too low to initiate a go-around. At 5:47 p.m., the A350's left engine struck the Dash 8's tail, igniting a massive fire. The Dash 8 was instantly destroyed, claiming the lives of 5 of its 6 crew members. Only the captain survived, though with severe injuries. Meanwhile, the A350 skidded nearly a kilometer down the runway, trailing flames and smoke before veering into the grass apron. Inside the plane, passengers felt the violent impact, followed by chaos as smoke quickly filled the cabin. Yet, thanks to the swift actions of the crew, all 367 passengers and 12 crew members were evacuated within 11 minutes, a remarkable outcome considering the devastation. The aircraft was completely destroyed, marking the first hull loss of an Airbus A350 since its introduction in 2015. Investigators later determined that this tragic accident was caused by a combination of miscommunication, human error, and a failure to notice the Dash 8 entering the runway. Nearly a year later, as 2024 drew to a close, another disaster struck, one that wasn't just an accident. Azerbaijan Airlines Flight 8243 was hit by a missile near Grozny. Despite sustaining severe damage, the aircraft remained airborne for some time before ultimately crashing, resulting in multiple casualties. On December 25, 2024, Azerbaijan Airlines Flight 8243, an Embraer 190, departed from Baku, bound for Grozny, Russia. On board were 62 passengers and 5 crew members. Approximately 40 minutes after takeoff, as the aircraft entered Russian airspace near Grozny, the weather began to deteriorate. At the same time, the crew reported a loss of GPS navigation. The aircraft's ADS-B signal disappeared, a strong indication of GPS jamming, an increasingly common issue in Russian-controlled airspace due to electronic warfare measures. Despite this, the pilots continued their approach and were cleared to land at Grozny Airport. Thick fog severely reduced visibility, forcing the crew to abort their first landing attempt. They made a second approach, but once again could not land. The pilots then informed air traffic control that they would return to Baku, but just as the aircraft turned away, disaster struck. Passengers reported hearing a loud explosion, followed by shrapnel tearing through the cabin. The plane had been hit by a missile fired from a Russian Pantsir S-1 air defense system, a short-range surface-to-air platform used to intercept aerial threats. The missile detonated near the aircraft's tail section, sending high-speed fragments ripping through the fuselage.
A passenger jet shot down by a Russian air defense system, an event that immediately raises questions. But depending on where you get your news, the way this story is told can look very different. And that's why I use Ground News, the sponsor of today's video. It's an app and website that gathers news worldwide, including local and on-the-ground sources, so you can easily compare coverage. I've been using Ground News for over a few months now, and I really like what they are accomplishing. And one of the things I found most useful is how it highlights media bias, showing differences in how the same story is told across different sources. Take this story for example. It's been reported by more than 1,000 sources, but subtle differences in wording can shape how it's interpreted. Left-leaning sources use loaded language like missile and accountability to emphasize Russia's military role. Center-leaning sources take a cautious approach, using allegedly to introduce doubt and focus on airspace security. Meanwhile, right-leaning sources state it as fact, directly blaming Russian air defenses and questioning military effectiveness. Ground News makes media bias clear, showing source credibility and funding. You can compare perspectives to see the full picture or filter for what matters most. Best of all, you control what you see, not an algorithm. Interested? Check them out at ground.news/ACI and use my link to save 40% on the same Vantage plan I use for unlimited access to all their features.
The crew, unaware of the full extent of the damage, initially attributed the impact to a bird strike and requested an emergency diversion. To signal distress, they set the transponder to 7700, the universal squawk code for emergencies, used to alert air traffic control and nearby aircraft of a critical situation. The pilots initially considered diverting to Mineralny Vody Airport, but after receiving reports of poor weather, they changed course toward Uytash Airport in Makhachkala. However, worsening conditions at Makhachkala forced them to reconsider. With few viable options left, they decided to head toward Aktau, Kazakhstan, flying over the Caspian Sea. At 10:02 local time, the aircraft entered Kazakh airspace, reappearing on ADS-B tracking while flying westward toward Aktau International Airport. By this point, unstable flight conditions were making control increasingly difficult. The pilots attempted an emergency landing but could not stabilize the approach, forcing a go-around. A second landing attempt also failed. On the third attempt, at 10:30 local time, communication with air traffic control was lost. Seconds later, the aircraft struck the ground 3 kilometers from Aktau International Airport. The right wing hit first, causing the aircraft to tumble, break apart, and explode upon impact. The fire consumed most of the front section, while the tail remained relatively intact, coming to rest upside down away from the main wreckage. Of the 67 people on board, 38 lost their lives, including both pilots and a flight attendant. 29 survived, many with severe injuries. Most of the survivors had been seated in the rear section of the aircraft. The tail section was riddled with puncture holes closely resembling the effects of a surface-to-air missile, which struck as air defenses attempted to repel a Ukrainian drone attack near Grozny. Survivors later confirmed that, mid-flight, shrapnel tore through the cabin, injuring both passengers and crew members. The downing of Azerbaijan Airlines Flight 8243 drew immediate comparisons to one of the most infamous aviation disasters of the 21st century. Flight MH17. On July 17, 2014, MH17, a Boeing 777, was flying over eastern Ukraine when it was shot down by a Russian-made Buk surface-to-air missile fired from territory controlled by pro-Russian separatists. The missile detonated just meters from the cockpit, instantly killing the flight crew and causing the aircraft to break apart mid-air. All 298 people on board lost their lives, including 193 Dutch nationals. The similarities between the two tragedies were undeniable. Both involved civilian aircraft struck by surface-to-air missiles, an exceptionally rare occurrence in modern aviation. But while incidents like these make headlines, most aviation disasters happen under far more routine circumstances. And that brings us to the next story. On July 24th, a CRJ-200 operated by Sauria Airlines was scheduled for a repositioning flight from Kathmandu's Tribhuvan International Airport to Pokhara. On board were 19 people, including 2 flight crew and 16 airline technicians. The aircraft had been parked for 34 days before the flight. A return-to-service inspection was performed that morning, and the plane was cleared for takeoff. The latest METAR report indicated a visibility of 8 kilometers, with few clouds at 1,000 feet and scattered clouds at 3,000 feet. At 11:10 a.m., the CRJ taxied to runway 02, rolled to the end of the runway, turned around, and began its takeoff roll. Immediately after liftoff, the aircraft exhibited unstable movements. It rolled to the right before sharply banking left, followed by another right roll. Just seconds later, the right wingtip struck the ground. The aircraft continued sliding forward, hitting a freight container before plunging into a 130-foot deep gorge near a hangar and a radar station. The impact triggered a fire, and thick smoke billowed from the wreckage. Firefighters arrived within a minute, working to extinguish the flames and rescue any survivors. Of the 19 people on board, 18 lost their lives. Only the captain survived. Both flight recorders were sent to Singapore for analysis under Nepal's Aircraft Accident Investigation Commission. The preliminary report in September found that the aircraft rotated excessively during takeoff, pitching up at a rate far higher than usual. Investigators also uncovered procedural oversights at Sauria Airlines, including improper loading and inaccurate performance calculations, with recorded takeoff speeds differing significantly from calculated values, raising concerns about safety management within the airline. This crash was another devastating aviation tragedy in 2024. But just weeks later, yet another deadly incident unfolded, this time in Brazil. On August 9, 2024, Flight 2283, an ATR 72-500, was en route from Cascavel to Guarulhos, São Paulo. On board were 58 passengers and 4 crew members. At the time of the accident, a SIGMET advisory was in effect, warning of severe icing conditions between 12,000 and 21,000 feet. Meteorological reports confirmed turbulence, thunderstorms, and significant icing in the region. Ice buildup on an aircraft can be extremely dangerous, increasing drag, reducing lift, and interfering with control surfaces. Severe icing can lead to a loss of aerodynamic performance, making it difficult, if not impossible, to maintain controlled flight. At 1:18 a.m. local time, Flight 2283 contacted São Paulo approach control and was cleared to enter the Sanpar position, maintaining a cruising altitude of 17,000 feet. However, just 2 minutes later, the situation began to deteriorate. The stall warning system activated. The aircraft rolled left, then sharply to the right, indicating a struggle for control. Despite the pilot's recovery attempts, the plane lost lift and entered an uncontrolled flat spin. In a final desperate effort, the pilots increased power, but the aircraft was already in a terminal descent. In less than a minute, the plane plummeted toward the ground at a rate of 24,000 feet per minute. At 1:22, all radar contact was lost. The aircraft crashed into the front yard of a house in a gated community in Vinhedo, São Paulo, approximately 76 kilometers northwest of its destination. All 58 passengers and 4 crew members perished. Among the victims were 6 oncologists traveling to a cancer conference, 4 university professors, and 2 children. 10 ticketed passengers missed the flight after waiting at the wrong gate. The Brazilian Aeronautical Accidents Investigation and Prevention Center launched an investigation. Both flight recorders were recovered and sent for analysis. A preliminary report confirmed the presence of ice buildup on the aircraft and multiple failed de-icing attempts. The pilots activated the de-icing system several times, but the flight data recorder data suggested it was not functioning as expected. Several months later, disaster struck in Lithuania, where a Swiftair Boeing 737 cargo jet crashed into a residential area. On November 25th, a Swiftair Boeing 737-400 cargo aircraft, carrying freight but no passengers, was approaching Vilnius International Airport when disaster struck. Preliminary reports indicate that the crew reported an unspecified emergency shortly after beginning their descent. Eyewitnesses described hearing an unusual engine noise and seeing the aircraft descend at an abnormally steep angle. Moments later, the freighter crashed into a residential area approximately 1.3 kilometers north of Vilnius International Airport. Local authorities, supported by CCTV footage, confirmed that the aircraft appeared to be in a controlled descent before losing altitude rapidly. The crash site revealed significant wreckage dispersion, suggesting a high-impact collision. 1 crew member was killed, and the other 3 were injured. Lithuanian aviation authorities and Swiftair's safety team are investigating the cause of the crash. ATC recordings reveal that the crew issued a distress call but were unable to provide specifics before communication ceased. The aircraft's flight recorders have been recovered and are expected to yield critical insights into the sequence of events leading to the crash. Fast forward to the year's final days, when disaster struck again. On December 29th, a Jeju Air Boeing 737 crashed at Muan International Airport, marking the deadliest aviation accident in South Korea in decades. The flight was uneventful until the final approach. Just before landing, air traffic control warned about the possibility of a bird strike. The aircraft then deviated several times from the approach path, possibly to avoid birds, but it always returned to the correct path. The airspeed remained stable and the rate of descent was normal. Muan International Airport has the highest rate of bird strikes among the 14 regional airports in South Korea. with 10 incidents in the last 5 years. The aircraft was approaching the airport around 9 a.m., a time when birds are typically most active. 2 minutes after receiving the warning, the crew declared a mayday due to a bird strike. They then initiated a go-around. The exact reason for this decision remains unclear to this day. Following standard procedure, the crew retracted the flaps and landing gear and requested to land in the opposite direction. This likely indicated the situation's urgency, suggesting they wanted to land as quickly as possible. They made a 180-degree turn and attempted to land on runway 19 without flaps and with the landing gear retracted. The reason the landing gear, flaps, and their respective backup systems failed to function or were not deployed remains unknown and must be determined through further investigation. Without the flaps deployed, the aircraft's landing speed was significantly higher than usual. Moreover, it touched down nearly halfway down the runway, leaving little space to decelerate. The nose was kept up during landing, which resulted in the aircraft maintaining a high speed due to less friction, making it hard to slow down. The right engine thrust reverser appeared to be used, but the plane could still not stop in time. The aircraft eventually overran the runway and crashed into a berm encasing a concrete structure that supported an antenna array for the instrument landing system. The collision killed all 175 passengers and 4 of the 6 crew members. The surviving 2 cabin crew were seated in the rear of the plane, which detached from the fuselage, and were rescued with injuries. They were taken to the hospital but were later discharged. Feathers and bird blood stains were found on each engine. The samples were sent to specialized organizations for DNA analysis, which identified them as belonging to Baikal teals, a small duck native to East Asia. While the spike in the number of plane crash-related deaths was unmistakable in 2024, aviation experts caution against jumping to conclusions based solely on statistics. Deadly passenger aircraft crashes remain rare, and even one major incident can dramatically impact the numbers, turning an otherwise statistically safe year into one of the worst. As Jan Arwed Richter, an aviation safety consultant, puts it, it's best to look at aviation safety over decade-long periods. I'm pretty confident that 2024 may be regarded as an outlier in years to come. In fact, according to the International Air Transport Association, 2023 recorded a fatal accident rate of 1 for every 1.26 million flights, the lowest rate in over a decade. To put it into perspective, that means a person would have to travel by air every day for 103,239 years to experience a single fatal accident. As we reflect on the tragedies of 2024, it's important to remember that aviation safety has made remarkable progress over the years, and the industry remains one of the safest modes of transport in the world.